The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and photocopied paper. I sat in a chair that wasn't mine, in a building I'd never been invited to across, from the son I raised, to be polite, until he stopped pretending. Travis crossed one leg over the other hands, folded like he'd practiced being important. "You can stay for the show, Mom, but you're not in it," he said loud enough for the lawyer to hear. I didn't answer. The man across the table, Mr. Klein, estate lawyer, starched shirt. Thinning hair slid a thick envelope from his briefcase and broke the seal like it was a ritual. I glanced at Travis. He was already leaning forward, chin lifted, already imagining himself in the house in Bend, already picturing the office on the top floor, already deciding which family members deserved to be invited back into his life. Victor Colby had died 2 weeks ago. Sudden heart failure. A man who outlived the marriage but never outgrew the legacy. I hadn't cried. Not when I got the call. Not at the memorial. Not when Travis gave the eulogy and didn't mention my name. The lawyer cleared his throat. "To Travis Colby?" Travis smiled. $5. Silence. Even the air felt still. Travis blinked. "I'm sorry." The lawyer didn't flinch. $5. To be paid in check form. Postmarked within 30 days. I didn't move, not a twitch. Mr. Klein turned a page. "To Ruthin Colby." His voice didn't change, but the room did. The entirety of the estate, including but not limited to all liquid assets, real property, business holdings, and intellectual property associated with Colby Custom Homes. I met Travis's eyes. He stared like he couldn't place me, like I was a detail in a painting he'd walked past 1,000 times and never noticed until it moved. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. The envelope was closed again. And just like that, the story they told about me began to fall apart. I didn't speak as I walked out of the building. Not to the reporters, not to Travis, not even to the woman who held the elevator for me. My coat was thin against the cold, but I kept it buttoned all the way up. I passed a cameraman who looked disappointed. He was clearly hoping the air would be someone flashier. They'd come for the son of Victor Colby, not the woman who used to pack his lunches. I reached the curb before I exhaled. A taxi pulled up without being called. I got in and gave my address. The driver didn't ask questions. By the time I reached home, the city noise had faded into that familiar hush. My apartment looked the same as I left it, plain, cramped, and still holding its breath. The radiator ticked in the corner like a slow clock, and a stack of envelopes leaned unread on the counter. Nothing had changed. The cabinet still creaked. The rug still curled at the edge. The second-hand lamp still flickered when I touched it. But something inside me had shifted. I boiled water, poured it into a mug with a hairline crack, and sat at the small table by the window. No celebration, no wine, just steam and silence. Then I opened the desk drawer and pulled out the folder. It was soft at the edges, fraying where I'd folded it too many times. Inside were receipts, notes, scanned contracts all dated and labeled in my own handwriting. But near the back was the one page that mattered, thick stock paper, with a faint blue stamp, and Victor's unsteady signature dated 6 months before his death. He'd sent it without a word. No explanation. Just the document, and a yellow sticky note that said, "You'll know when to use it." Now I did. He'd known about the consulting payments, about the silent withdrawals, about Travis treating the company like a personal buffet line. Victor hadn't apologized. But this was the closest thing to an admission I was ever going to get. And now I had the tools to undo everything they'd built on silence. She stayed home. She just typed. That's how Travis described me at investor dinners and holiday parties if he mentioned me at all. She didn't build anything. I heard it more than once passed around like fact. Said by people who didn't know I was the one who stayed up rewriting the subcontractor agreements after Victor fell asleep on the couch. who didn't know that in the early years I balanced the books down to the cent while dinner cooled untouched on the stove. I never argued. I let them shape the narrative. It cost less than being called difficult. Victor once told me during one of our quieter nights, "You're good at the things people forget to thank you for." I think he meant it as praise. I took it as warning. But now the story is cracking. The message comes in just after noon. A short email. Just a few lines from the firm. Per the terms of the trust, you are the controlling stakeholder in Colby Custom Homes. As of today, all decisions require your authorization unless otherwise delegated. I stare at the screen until the letters lose their shape. I had expected assets. Maybe even one of the vacation properties he used to brag about. But not this. Not the company. Not the one Travis has spent the last decade calling his legacy. I go to the window. Outside, a delivery van is parked too close to the hydrant. The driver leaves the hazard lights on, like that makes it legal. In that moment, I think of all the people who called me lucky. Lucky to have married Victor. Lucky to raise a son who made something of himself. Lucky to be quiet. Lucky to still be here. But I wasn't lucky. I was exact. And now the company they built on my absence is back in my hands. I press reply, tell the firm to proceed with verification, and ask for the full shareholder record. Let's see how much of it was built on fiction. The second envelope was heavier. I hadn't noticed it in the office. Everything had blurred once the lawyer said my name, then everything else. But now, sitting at my kitchen table, I ran my thumb under the flap and slid out the pages. The trust was clean, concise, final. No room for misreading. I was listed as sole beneficiary. No conditions, no cosigners, no tricks. But tucked behind the legal language was a separate document printed on heavier paper. A personal addendum. Not notarized, not necessary, but signed. In Victor's handwriting. I destroyed my marriage, it began, but not my memory of her. This is what I owe. He didn't use my name. He didn't have to. Below that were numbered items. 2 offshore accounts, 1 property in Colorado, another in Oregon. Each referenced by code and holding company, but I recognize the names. Then near the bottom, if Travis contests this trust, alert the firm's forensic team. He has already accessed restricted funds. The sentence was underlined. Twice. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Victor had always been good at avoidance, at leaving the mess to someone else. So for him to lay this out here at the end meant he knew just how far it had gone. He'd watched Travis cross lines, maybe not all at once, but little by little. And he'd waited. The lawyer had hinted earlier Mr. Colby kept detailed records. He seemed concerned about his son's transactions. I'd nodded, but I hadn't asked for more. Because I already knew. I'd seen the numbers change, the accounts rerouted, the contracts padded. Not on paper, they were careful about that, but in tone, in timing, in the way Travis stopped answering certain questions. What I didn't know was that Victor had been watching too. And now, through this folded page and a reluctant confession, he'd handed me not just the keys, but the map. The foundation may have been mine all along, but now I had the proof to make it visible. I called the lawyer and asked him to connect me to the auditor listed in the file. He picked the country club. Of course he did. Same one Victor used to talk about like it was a reward. I hadn't been inside since the mid-90s. Back then I was just Mrs. Colby, the kind of woman who held purses while the men shook hands. The host blinked when I gave my name, glanced down the list, then up at me like he'd misheard. I didn't bother correcting him. He looked relieved when I added, "I'm meeting Travis Colby. Right this way." The dining room was too bright, too polished. I spotted Travis before he saw me. Already seated, scrolling through his phone, a glass of something expensive, sweating next to his untouched bread. He looked up and gave me that practiced smile, the one he used for photo ops and property closings. "Mom," he said, like it was a joke, "you look formal. I wore the same gray coat I'd worn to Victor's memorial. Not out of sentiment, just because it still fit. He waited until the waiter left before leaning in. So this whole thing he waved vaguely toward the idea of the will must be a mistake. I raised an eyebrow. That lawyer's confused. You were married decades ago. I remember the wedding, I said. And the first mortgage. And the business license I typed up in our basement. He laughed. It was too loud, too sharp. Come on, Mom. Be reasonable. You're not equipped for this. This, I asked. He dropped his voice. Look, if you sign it over, we'll let you keep the house in Portland. You'll be comfortable. I tilted my head. I already sold it, I said. He blinked. I folded my napkin slowly and set it on the table. I didn't come here to negotiate, I said. I came to see if there was still a part of you worth protecting. He didn't answer. By the time dessert menus arrived, I was already putting on my coat, letting him stew in the quiet he'd never learned how to sit with. I sat at the kitchen table long after the restaurant's noise had faded from my head. The napkin from the club was still in my bag, folded into a perfect square. I took it out, stared at the embossed logo, and dropped it into the trash. Then I opened my old address book. The paper was yellowed, the ink smudged. Near the back, beneath a column of names that no longer mattered, was one number written in neat block letters. L. Walsh Office. I dialed. It rang twice. Lydia Walsh came, the voice crisp and unshaken, exactly as I remembered. Lydia, I said. It's Ruthin? There was a pause, a long one. Then a quiet exhale. She told me you might call. I asked, though I already knew, Victor, Lydia said. He had a sense of timing. I closed my eyes. So do I. The conversation moved like an old rhythm, careful but familiar. Years ago, I'd asked Lydia to build a small firewall around certain accounts, nothing large, just enough to protect the payroll and tax files in case Victor's partners turned reckless. I'd called it a contingency. Lydia had called it foresight. Back then, I'd thought I was being paranoid. Now, it felt like prophecy. I still have access, she said. After the will was read, I checked. There's something you should see. She forwarded the files before I could respond. Within minutes, my screen filled with columns of figures and names. Travis's handwriting appeared in scanned invoices marked consulting fees. The shell companies were obvious single-address outfits tied to his old classmates. The totals made my stomach tighten. Lydia, I said softly, how long has this been going on? Too long, she said. And Victor knew. He signed off on the audit 6 months before he died. I scrolled line by line, watching the pattern unfold the same way I used to track budgets when the company was just an idea on our dining table. The difference now was the scale. The numbers weren't just messy, they were criminal. I stared at the screen until the figures stopped blurring, then reached for the phone again to make my next call. The bank was quiet. Midweek afternoons always were. No noise, no audience, just paper process and air that smelled faintly of toner and old carpet. I didn't bring a lawyer. I didn't need one. The documents were already prepared. Lydia had helped me finalize the paperwork over the weekend. She said the estate planner would know what to do once he saw the signatures. I checked in with the receptionist and waited. A man in a tailored suit called my name and led me down a long hallway. He was polite, cautious, the kind of cautious that comes from reading a file with too many zeros attached to it. We sat in a conference room with glass walls and neutral art. I placed the sealed envelope on the table and slid it across. I'd like to initiate the transfer, I said. Split the holdings. Liquidate half. Move the rest under the original trust. All in my name. He opened the envelope, slowly scanned the top pages, then looked up. Ms. Colby, he said carefully, this will effectively remove your son from any future business interest. Entirely. I didn't blink. There's no cut left. He already took his. He nodded once and got to work. There were signatures, counter-signatures, and a notary brought in to witness. My hand didn't shake. I didn't pause to reread anything. The numbers were correct. The intent was clear. By the time we finished, the bank's system had triggered a security protocol standard for any flagged transfer of this size. He excused himself to make a call. 10 minutes later, he returned. "Our forensic compliance team has been notified," he said. "Per policy, they'll begin reviewing the shell accounts attached to Colby Custom Homes. We'll be in touch." I stood, collected my copy of the documents, and thanked him. Outside, the sky was low with gray but dry. I walked home without an umbrella, the folder under one arm, my bag over the other. By the time I reached my front door, the audit clock had already started counting down. Monday at 9 would be the first crack. The elevator ride to the top floor was quiet. Familiar in a strange way. I'd ridden it once years ago before they remodeled, when Victor still parked in the back lot and used the same mug every morning. Now the walls were glass and steel, everything polished to suggest power. The receptionist didn't recognize me. She stood when I approached. "Can I help you?" I set my bag down. "Tell your CEO his board chair has arrived." Her eyes darted to the phone. "I'm sorry I didn't catch Ruthin Colby," I said evenly. "He'll understand." She hesitated, then pressed a button and spoke quietly into the receiver. The door to the executive wing opened before she could finish. Travis stood in the hallway, jaw set, face drained of color. He didn't say anything. I didn't either. He stepped aside. I walked past him. The boardroom was cold, not in temperature, just in mood. 6 directors sat along one side, eyes flicking between me and the man they thought they understood. I placed the folder in the center of the table. No speech, no emotion, just the facts. Page 1 detailed the unauthorized wire transfers. Page 2 mapped the shell accounts. Page 3 confirmed the forensic audit had already begun. Travis reached for the papers, then froze when 2 members of the compliance team walked in behind me. I took the last seat at the table and folded my hands. No one said, "Mom." Not today. They addressed me as Chairwoman Colby. Halfway through the hour, the board requested an executive session. I stood, nodded, and walked out. I didn't look back. Outside, I paused at the elevator. The receptionist avoided my gaze. Travis's voice echoed faintly through the glass wall, still protesting, still spinning. The door closed behind me. Downstairs, the sun had shifted across the lobby, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The audit wasn't finished, but the illusion was, and the building would never look the same again. When I got home, the air still carried the faint echo of that boardroom muffled voices, the scrape of chairs, the sound of men realizing they'd underestimated a woman they'd forgotten existed. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it until the quiet settled back in. The apartment looked the same. It always did, but I didn't sit down. I went straight to the hallway closet and pulled out the old cardboard box from the top shelf. It was heavier than I remembered. I hadn't opened it since the move, not because I was avoiding it, because I didn't see the point. Inside were pieces of a life that had long since been revised by other people's versions of it. The first layer was photographs. Victor and me on our wedding day, his grin wide, my smile tight with hope. A picture of Travis as a baby asleep against my shoulder. One from the coast wind pulling at my hair, while Victor built a sandcastle he later claimed as ours. Beneath the photos were folders, tax returns, letters from banks, pay stubs with my name crossed out replaced with his when the business grew too fast for its own honesty. I traced the ink where my signature used to be. For years I let the story go on without correction. I told myself it was easier that way, that it didn't matter who got the credit, as long as the work survived. But now, looking at those papers, I knew what it meant to reclaim your own handwriting. At the bottom was the letter Victor left, the one attached to the trust documents. I placed it on top, closed the box, and sealed the lid with clear tape. Not denial. readiness. I wasn't preparing for an audience. I was preparing for continuity. The documents I'd signed at the bank were stacked neatly beside the safe I'd installed last month. I slid them inside, locked the door, and turned the handle once more to make sure it caught. Everything that needed to be said was now written down. Tomorrow, the building would bear my name. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carried weight without chill. I stood on the sidewalk across from the new building, watching the last of the scaffolding come down. It wasn't grand or flashy, just solid. Brick, stone, clean lines. Built for use, not display. 6 months had passed since the audit. Since the boardroom silence. Since Travis's resignation for personal reasons, though the financial papers told a louder truth. He hadn't spoken to me since, and I hadn't needed him to. The foundation had been their idea, not mine. The new board, half of them women, had voted to dedicate part of the company's profits toward trades training and grants. For women, like I once was. For the ones who did the quiet work in back rooms while someone else took credit out front. They asked permission to use my name. I didn't give it right away. But eventually, I said yes. The plaque had been mounted the week before. Brass, heavy, simple. It caught the light just enough to be noticed, but not enough to invite spectacle. Ruthin Colby Foundation for Women in Trades. I wore the same gray coat. Not for symbolism, just because it still fit. The unveiling ceremony was brief. Someone from the mayor's office gave a speech. So did the new CEO, a woman I'd met twice, both times, impressed by how little she tried to impress anyone. I didn't speak. Afterward, a young architect approached me. Nervous hands, scuffed boots. She said the grant saved her license renewal after a layoff. Said it came at the exact moment she was ready to walk away. I thanked her for building. She looked confused, then smiled. I stepped back from the crowd as the cameras turned elsewhere. No more arguments left, no more corrections to make. Only the work. Only the wall. And my name there now, steady and unclaimed, right where it always should have been.